The mansion stood on top of a small hill, far away from the noise of the city, surrounded by tall iron gates, shining black cars, and gardens so perfect they looked almost unreal. People passing by would often slow down just to look at it. Some would point, some would whisper. Everyone in the area knew who lived there. A man known for his money, a man known for his power, a man who had built an empire from almost nothing and turned it into something people could only dream about. Hotels, businesses, buildings, private investments. His name was connected to success everywhere. Newspapers talked about him. Business channels praised him. Rich people wanted to sit beside him. Young entrepreneurs wanted to become him. But the people who worked inside his mansion knew a different side of him. Inside those beautiful walls, silence meant safety. The workers moved carefully, spoke softly, and never stayed in one place for too long. Every task had to be perfect. Every plate had to shine. Every floor had to reflect like glass. One mistake could ruin an entire day. Not because anyone would scream. That almost never happened. What made people nervous was much worse. It was the way he looked at people when they disappointed him. Cold, quiet, sharp. A single look from him could make even experienced workers forget what they were doing. And because of that, nobody wanted his attention. Especially not the newest maid. She had arrived almost 6 months earlier with only one small bag, simple clothes, and quiet eyes that seemed to notice everything but reveal nothing. She never asked for special treatment. Never complained. Never joined gossip in the kitchen. Never wasted time. She worked, and worked hard. Before sunrise, she was already awake. Long before the cooks started breakfast. Long before the gardeners walked outside. Long before the drivers cleaned the cars. She would quietly move through the long hallways, dusting paintings, polishing tables, arranging flowers, folding towels, cleaning windows, and making sure every room looked untouched. Most people barely noticed her, and she seemed to prefer it that way. If someone asked for help, she helped. If someone needed something carried, she carried it. If someone made a mistake and needed extra hands, she stayed late without saying a word. Some of the older workers admired her. Some of the younger ones felt sorry for her. Because no matter how hard she worked, the owner of the mansion never seemed to notice she even existed. And maybe that was a good thing. At least that's what everyone believed. One evening, after another long day, the mansion slowly became quiet. The guests were gone. The dining hall was empty. The kitchen lights grew dim. One by one, the workers returned to their small rooms in the staff building behind the mansion. But one person stayed behind. The young maid. She carried a small basket filled with fresh cloths and cleaning supplies as she walked through the main hallway. Her footsteps were soft against the marble floor. She stopped in front of the largest room in the mansion. The ballroom. Even after months of working there, that room still looked unreal. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling like frozen stars. Tall windows reached almost to the floor. Golden details covered the walls. And in the center of it all, stood the grand piano. Black, polished, perfect. It looked almost alive under the soft lights. She stood there for a moment, then another. Her eyes stayed fixed on it. Her breathing slowed. And for the first time all day, she smiled. It was small, almost invisible, but real. She slowly walked closer, very slowly, as if she was approaching something sacred. She stopped just a few steps away. Her fingers tightened around the cleaning cloth. Her eyes moved across the piano keys. White, black, white, black. Something changed in her face. Something deep, something old. She lifted one hand, very carefully, not touching, just hovering above the keys. Her fingers began to move, softly, silently, as if they already knew exactly where every note lived. As if they had done this thousands of times before. Left, right, pause, move. A silent song only she could hear. She closed her eyes for a second. And in that moment, she was no longer a maid. She was somewhere else. Somewhere far away. Somewhere warm. Somewhere filled with music. But then, what are you doing? The voice broke the silence like glass. Her eyes opened instantly. She stepped back. A security guard stood near the doorway, staring at her with raised eyebrows. She quickly lowered her hand. "Nothing," she said softly. The guard looked at her, then looked at the piano, then back at her. He smiled a little. "Looked like something." She said nothing. She simply picked up her basket and walked away. The guard watched her disappear down the hallway, and even after she was gone, he kept thinking about what he had just seen. The next morning, in the kitchen, whispers started. "I heard she plays." "No chance. Why would a maid know piano? Maybe she learned online. Maybe she's pretending. Maybe she touched the piano. Careful. If he hears that." The whispers spread faster than anyone expected. From the kitchen, to the drivers, to the gardeners, to the cleaning staff, to the personal assistants. And before the day was over, the rumor reached the one person nobody wanted involved. The owner. He sat in his private office on the top floor, reading financial reports while sunlight came through giant glass windows. A senior employee stood in front of his desk, clearly nervous. "There's something you may find amusing." The businessman didn't look up. "Speak." The employee cleared his throat. "One of the maids." Silence. "She was seen near the ballroom piano." Still silence. The employee swallowed. "Some people think she knows how to play." For the first time, the businessman looked up. His face showed no emotion. But then, very slowly, a smile appeared. Not warm, not kind. The kind of smile that made people uncomfortable. "A maid?" The employee nodded. "Yes." The businessman leaned back in his chair. His fingers tapped lightly on the wooden desk. Then he looked toward the window. Far below, workers moved across the gardens like tiny figures. And somewhere among them was the quiet girl no one noticed. He smiled again. This time longer. "Interesting." The employee suddenly wished he had never brought it up. Because everyone in that mansion knew one thing. Whenever that smile appeared, someone's life was about to change. And downstairs, completely unaware, the young maid continued working, polishing silver, folding linen, serving tea, not knowing that by tomorrow night, every eye in the mansion would be on her, and nothing would ever be the same again. Morning came to the mansion like it always did. The sun rose over the hills, light touched the gardens, and the workers began another long day of silent routines. Cars were cleaned. Breakfast was prepared. Floors were polished until they reflected the ceiling like mirrors. Everything looked normal. But inside the staff quarters, nothing felt normal. Whispers followed her everywhere. In the kitchen, in the hallway, near the laundry room, even outside by the flower garden. Whenever she walked past, conversations stopped for a second, then quietly started again. Some workers looked curious. Some looked nervous. Some looked sorry for her. She noticed all of it, but she said nothing. She simply kept working. Her hands folded fresh towels. Her feet moved through the long hallways. Her eyes stayed lowered. But deep inside, something felt different. Something felt wrong. She didn't know how. She didn't know why. But the quiet safety she had built over the last 6 months suddenly felt fragile. As if something invisible was moving closer. Around noon, one of the older kitchen workers quietly walked up beside her while she arranged silver trays. The woman had worked in the mansion for nearly 15 years. She had seen workers come and go. She had seen people cry. She had seen careers end in a single afternoon. She lowered her voice. "You need to be careful." The young maid looked at her. "About what?" The older woman glanced around before speaking. "He knows." The maid froze. Her fingers stopped moving. For a second, she thought maybe she had heard wrong. "Who?" The older woman didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Everyone knew who he meant. The maid's heart began beating faster. "What did they say?" "That you were seen near the piano." Silence. The older woman looked into her eyes. "And now he's interested." Those words felt heavier than anything else. Interested. In that mansion, attention from the owner was never a good thing. The maid forced herself to stay calm. She nodded once. Thank you. The older woman touched her shoulder gently. Just keep your head down. Then she walked away. But the warning stayed. All day. Every minute. Every task. Even while serving coffee. Even while dusting bookshelves. Even while changing flowers in the guest rooms. Her mind kept returning to one thought. How much did he know? By late afternoon, expensive cars began arriving one after another. Black cars. Silver cars. Long cars with drivers wearing white gloves. Tonight was clearly important. Business guests. Investors. People with power. People with money. The mansion slowly transformed. Fresh flowers filled every room. Crystal glasses sparkled under golden lights. Music played softly from hidden speakers. Chefs moved faster. Assistants checked every detail. Security guards stood straighter. And every worker understood one thing. Tonight had to be perfect. As evening came, the young maid was assigned to the ballroom. Of all places, her heart dropped the moment she heard it. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to ask for another task. But in that mansion, workers didn't make requests. They followed orders. So she prepared the ballroom. She arranged glasses, straightened chairs, folded napkins, checked candles, polished silver. And all the while, the grand piano sat quietly in the center of the room, waiting. Its black surface reflected the crystal lights above. Its keys looked almost alive. She tried not to look at it. But somehow, her eyes kept returning. Memory after memory began rising inside her. Small hands on old piano keys. Warm afternoons. Soft voices. Patient lessons. Laughter. Music. Home. She quickly looked away. That life was gone. It had been gone for years. And she had worked too hard to bury it. Tonight was just another job. Nothing more. Nothing less. Guests began arriving. The ballroom slowly filled with voices, laughter, and expensive perfume. Men in tailored suits, women in shining dresses, glasses clinking, business deals being whispered, polite smiles hiding sharp intentions. The young maid moved quietly between them, serving drinks, collecting empty glasses, avoiding eye contact. Invisible, just like always. At least, that's what she hoped. Then the room suddenly grew quieter. Not silent, but different. The kind of silence that spreads when someone important enters. She didn't need to look. She already knew. The owner had arrived. He walked into the ballroom with calm confidence, greeting guests with practiced charm. Every conversation seemed to bend around him. Every eye followed him. Every smile grew wider. He looked comfortable, powerful, untouchable. The young maid kept her eyes down as he passed. Maybe he wouldn't notice. Maybe the rumors had already bored him. Maybe, stop. Her body froze. The single word wasn't loud, but it reached her like thunder. The entire room seemed to pause. She slowly turned around. He was looking directly at her. For the first time since she started working there, his full attention was on her. And somehow, that felt worse than anger. His face looked calm, almost friendly, but his eyes were studying her, like he had discovered something interesting. He took a slow sip from his glass, then smiled. Not warmly, never warmly. I hear you have a talent. The room became quieter. Nearby guests began listening. The maid swallowed. I don't know what you mean. A few guests chuckled. The businessman smiled wider. Oh. He took another step closer. I was told you enjoy my piano. Some guests laughed softly. Others looked curious. The maid felt heat rising in her face. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open beneath her. Instead, she stood still. I was only cleaning, sir. He looked at her for a long moment, then suddenly laughed. A smooth, controlled laugh. And his guests joined him. Well, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. If the rumors are true, he turned toward the crowd. Then perhaps tonight deserves a little entertainment. Laughter spread through the ballroom. Glasses lifted. Smiles widened. The maid's chest tightened. No, please no. but he was already walking toward the piano. Slowly, confidently, every guest turned to watch. He placed one hand on the piano's polished surface, then looked back at her. "Come." She didn't move. Her legs felt frozen. One of the assistants quietly whispered behind her. "Go." She took one step, then another, then another. Each step felt heavier. The crowd opened as she walked. Dozens of eyes followed her. Some amused, some curious, some already expecting failure. She reached the piano. The businessman pulled out the bench. Then, with a smile that made the room lean closer, he gestured toward it. "Sit." Her hands trembled. She looked at the keys, then at the crowd, then at him. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Her breathing became shallow. The room felt smaller, warmer, louder, and somehow, completely silent at the same time. She slowly sat down. The piano bench felt colder than she expected. Her fingers rested in her lap, tight, still. The businessman stepped back beside his guests, arms crossed, waiting, watching, smiling. The maid stared at the keys. White, black, white, black. Her hands slowly lifted, still shaking. The entire ballroom held its breath. And just before her fingers touched the first key, she closed her eyes and remembered who she used to be. For a few long seconds, nothing moved. Not the guests, not the servers standing near the walls, not the security guards by the doors. Even the soft music playing from hidden speakers had already been turned off. The ballroom had become completely silent. The young maid sat in front of the grand piano, her eyes closed, her hands hovering just above the keys. Her breathing was slow, deep, controlled. But inside her chest, her heart was beating harder than ever. She could feel every eye on her, every smile, every doubt, every person waiting for her to fail, waiting for an awkward sound, waiting for an embarrassing mistake, waiting for something they could laugh at. At the back of the room, a few guests were already holding back small smiles. One man quietly leaned toward another and whispered something that made them both chuckle. A woman lifted her glass, clearly expecting a moment of entertainment. The businessman stood near the piano with his arms folded across his chest, his expression calm, confident, almost amused. He looked completely certain. Certain this would go exactly the way he imagined. Certain this would become a funny story told over expensive dinners for years. But the young maid wasn't looking at any of them. Her eyes stayed closed. And in that darkness behind her eyelids, the ballroom slowly disappeared. The crystal lights disappeared. The laughter disappeared. The expensive clothes, the sharp eyes, the pressure, the fear, all of it faded. And in its place, a memory returned. A small wooden house, warm sunlight coming through old curtains, a piano that had scratches on the edges, a pair of gentle hands guiding hers, a soft voice saying, "Don't play with fear." Another voice, "Play with truth." A smile, a warm room, a life that once felt safe. Her fingers stopped shaking. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing became steady. And very slowly, her hands lowered. The tip of one finger touched the first key. A single note filled the ballroom. Soft, pure, clear, not too loud, not too weak, just perfect. The sound floated through the room like a drop of water touching still glass. And in that instant, something changed. The smiles on a few faces faded. A woman who had been sipping her drink slowly lowered her glass. A man near the fireplace straightened his back. Even the businessman's eyes narrowed just a little. Then, a second note. Then a third. Then another. And another. Soon the notes began connecting. Slowly. Smoothly. Like pieces of a story finding each other. The melody was gentle at first. Almost shy. As if testing the room. Testing the listeners. Testing whether anyone was truly willing to hear. Then her left hand joined. And suddenly, the music became something alive. Her fingers moved across the keys with quiet confidence. Not rushed. Not nervous. Not uncertain. Every movement looked natural. Every note seemed to know exactly where it belonged. The room grew even quieter. No one whispered now. No one laughed. No one moved. The guests stared, completely still, as if afraid even breathing too loudly might break whatever was happening. The young maid's eyes remained closed. She wasn't performing for them. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply remembering, and the music carried all of it. The joy, the pain, the loss, the hope, the memories, all of it lived inside every note. A few moments later, something unexpected happened. One of the older female guests quietly reached for a chair and sat down. Not because she was tired, because she couldn't stop listening. A man near the back slowly removed his glasses and stared. Another guest lowered his phone before he even realized he had raised it. One by one, people forgot where they were, forgot why they came, forgot the business deals, forgot the expensive conversations, forgot their polished smiles. All that existed now was the music. The businessman kept his arms folded, but his smile was gone, completely gone. His eyes stayed fixed on her hands, watching every movement, every note, every transition, every impossible moment where her fingers seemed to glide effortlessly across the keys. At first he looked confused, then curious, then something else, something he probably hadn't felt in a long time. Uncertainty. Across the ballroom, one of the kitchen workers stood quietly near the door. Her eyes had filled with tears. Beside her, a security guard slowly shook his head in disbelief. "I knew it," he whispered. Another worker quietly replied, "No." His eyes stayed fixed on the piano. "We had no idea." The melody began to grow stronger, deeper, more powerful. Her fingers moved faster now, still graceful, still controlled, but carrying more emotion, more fire, more truth. Her shoulders moved with the rhythm. Her breathing stayed calm. Her face looked peaceful, almost free. And for the first time in years, she no longer looked like a maid. She no longer looked invisible. She looked exactly like who she had always been. Someone born for this. Someone who belonged with music. Someone who had been hiding in silence. Until now, the notes rose higher, faster, brighter. The ballroom filled with sounds so rich, so alive, so unexpected, that even the chandeliers seemed to vibrate with it. And then, one guest suddenly stood up, not from excitement, not from applause, but from shock. He was an older man, silver hair, sharp eyes, a face shaped by time and experience. He had been sitting quietly near the back all evening, barely speaking to anyone. Most people hadn't even noticed him. But now, he was standing, completely frozen. His face had turned pale. His eyes were wide, locked on the young maid, not with amusement, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if he were seeing a ghost, as if he had heard something impossible, something he thought was lost forever. The people nearest him turned in surprise. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer. He took one slow step forward, then another. His eyes never left the piano. Meanwhile, the young maid continued playing, unaware, lost in the music. The businessman noticed the older man's reaction, and for the first time that night, even he looked concerned, because this wasn't part of the joke. This wasn't part of the plan. The older man moved closer, 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 until he stood only a few feet away from the piano. His lips parted slightly, his eyes looked almost wet, and then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he spoke a single name, a name no one else in the room recognized, a name from a life the young maid had buried years ago. And the moment she heard it, her eyes flew open, her fingers froze above the keys, and the final note hung in the air like a secret that had finally found its way home. The final note still floated in the air, soft, gentle, almost alive. No one in the ballroom moved. No one spoke. It was as if the music had taken hold of every person in the room and refused to let go. The young maid sat frozen on the piano bench, her fingers still hovering above the keys. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it. Then she heard it again, That name. The name the older man had whispered. A name she had not heard in years. A name from another life. A life she had buried so deeply that sometimes even she wondered if it had really happened. Her hands slowly dropped into her lap. Her eyes lifted, and for the first time, she looked directly at the older man. The moment their eyes met, the color drained from her face. Her breathing caught. Her lips parted slightly. She didn't say anything. She couldn't, because she knew him. Not from this mansion. Not from this city. Not from this life. She knew him from long before any of this. From before uniforms. Before silent hallways. Before cleaning silver trays and polishing marble floors. Back when music was not a secret. Back when music was home. The older man took another slow step closer. His eyes were wet. Not with sadness. With disbelief. As if he had spent years looking for something he never expected to find. Around them, the guests looked from one face to another, completely confused. Some exchanged quiet whispers. Some leaned forward. Even the servers standing by the walls forgot their duties. The businessman himself looked more serious than anyone had ever seen. The joke was gone now. Completely gone. This was no longer entertainment. This was something else. Something none of them understood. The older man spoke again. This time louder. Still gentle. Still almost trembling. It really is you. The young maid swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry. Her voice, when it finally came, was almost a whisper. How? The older man gave a small, emotional smile. I would know those hands anywhere. A quiet wave of confusion spread across the room. The businessman slowly stepped forward. His voice was calm, controlled, but no longer amused. You know her? The older man didn't look away from the maid. For several seconds he simply stared. Then he nodded. Years ago. The guests grew even quieter. The businessman crossed his arms again. But this time it wasn't confidence. It was uncertainty. From where? The older man finally turned. His voice was steady now. From concert halls. The room fell completely silent. Not a single glass moved. Not a single whisper remained. The word seemed impossible. Concert halls? People slowly looked back at the young maid. The same quiet girl who folded towels. The same girl who carried tea trays. The same girl nobody noticed. The same girl standing in plain clothes with tired hands. Concert halls? It made no sense. One of the women near the front laughed softly. Not mockingly. Nervously. Surely there's some mistake. The older man looked at her. There is no mistake. Then he turned back toward the young maid. His eyes softened. I watched her play when she was barely tall enough to reach the pedals. A few guests gasped quietly. The businessman's expression changed. Just slightly. Not shock. Not yet. But curiosity. Real curiosity. The maid lowered her eyes. Her hands tightened in her lap. She had spent years hiding. Years making sure nobody asked questions. Years becoming invisible. And now, in a single night, everything was being pulled back into the light. The older man moved closer until he stood beside the piano. He spoke softly. You disappeared. Her eyes stayed down. So did everything else. His face fell. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room waited. Then the older man took a slow breath. What happened? The question hung in the air. Simple. Gentle. But heavy. The young maid looked at the piano keys. White, black, white, black. Her fingers touched one key softly. Not playing. Just touching. Like touching an old memory. Her voice was quiet. So quiet that the guests leaned forward to hear. Life happened. No one smiled. No one moved. She took another breath. And for the first time in years, she stopped hiding. When I was little, her voice trembled. But only a little. Music was everywhere. She looked at her hands. My home was never big. A small smile touched her lips. But it was always full. Full of sound. Full of practice. Full of mistakes. Full of lessons. Her eyes grew distant. As if she was no longer in the ballroom. As if she was somewhere warm. Somewhere safe. My mornings began with scales. My afternoons with practice. My evenings with performances. A few guests exchanged stunned looks. The businessman remained silent, listening. Actually listening. The maid continued. My family didn't have much. She paused. But what we had we loved. The older man quietly nodded, as if every word matched a memory. Then her voice changed, became quieter, heavier. One winter, her fingers tightened. Everything changed. The room somehow grew even stiller. She stared at the keys, not blinking. There was an accident. No details, no drama, just those words. And somehow, they hit harder than anything else. A woman near the fireplace slowly covered her mouth. The maid kept speaking. After that, she swallowed. There were hospital bills, debt, goodbyes, closed doors, lost opportunities. Her voice remained calm, but everyone could hear what sat behind it. Years of pain, years of sacrifice, years of silence. She gave a small smile, a sad one. Music doesn't disappear. She touched the piano softly. But sometimes, she looked around the ballroom. At some point, you stop performing, and you start surviving. No one spoke. No one could. The words felt too real, too human, too honest. Even the businessman looked different now. His face no longer carried pride, or amusement, or control. Only thought, deep thought. The older man's voice shook slightly. I searched for you. The maid looked up. For the first time, tears touched her eyes. I know. He frowned. You knew. She nodded slowly. I saw your interviews. I saw your concerts. I saw the schools you built. The older man looked confused. Then why didn't you come? She looked down again. And this time, her answer hit every person in the room harder than the music ever had. Because I didn't want pity. Silence. Complete silence. The older man closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to hold back emotion. The guests looked at her differently now. Not as staff. Not as entertainment. Not as a joke. But as someone far stronger than any of them realized. Then suddenly, the older man reached inside his coat. The movement caught everyone's attention. He pulled out something small, old, folded, worn with time. He held it carefully, almost respectfully, then placed it gently on top of the piano. The maid looked down, and the moment she saw it, her breath stopped, her eyes widened, her hand slowly rose toward it, because sitting there, under the crystal lights, was something she thought had been lost forever. For a few seconds, the young maid could not breathe. She stared at the object resting on top of the piano as if the world around her had suddenly disappeared. The ballroom, the guests, the lights, the whispers, all of it faded. Only that small, worn piece of paper remained. Her fingers trembled as she slowly reached toward it. Carefully, almost fearfully, as if touching it too quickly might make it disappear. The older man stepped back and said nothing. He didn't need to. He already knew. The moment her fingertips touched the paper, her entire body froze. She unfolded it slowly, very slowly, and as the paper opened, her eyes filled with tears. It was old. The corners were bent. The edges had faded with time. A few marks had become almost impossible to read. But she knew every line, every note, every symbol, because it wasn't just sheet music. It was hers. The very first composition she had ever written. She had written it as a child, late at night, sitting beside an old lamp, after everyone else had gone to sleep. A melody she had created with small hands and big dreams. A melody she thought had been lost forever. Her lips parted slightly. How? The word barely escaped. The older man smiled softly. I kept it. The room stayed silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Nobody even wanted to breathe too loudly. The young maid looked up at him. Her eyes were shining now, not from sadness, from memory, from shock, from something deeper. You still have it. The older man nodded. I kept everything. She looked back down at the paper. Her fingers moved over the notes, as if greeting old friends. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she quietly laughed. A small laugh. A real one. The kind nobody in that mansion had ever heard from her. Several workers near the doors looked at each other. They had worked beside her for months, and none of them had ever seen her smile like that. The businessman remained standing near the piano, silent, watching, listening, trying to understand. For perhaps the first time in years, he wasn't the most important person in the room, and everyone could feel it. The older man looked at her gently. "You were 12. She smiled through her tears. 12 and stubborn. A few guests quietly smiled. The older man laughed softly. "You refused to play anyone else's music." She wiped her eyes. "I thought I knew everything." "You knew more than most adults." A quiet murmur moved through the room. People looked at the maid differently now. Not as someone serving drinks. Not as someone cleaning floors. But as someone whose story had once touched much bigger stages. The businessman finally stepped forward. His voice was calm, but very different now. No pride, no mockery, no performance. Only curiosity. "You wrote that?" The maid slowly looked at him. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then she nodded. "Yes." The businessman stared at the sheet music. Then at her. Then back at the paper. He looked like a man trying to solve something impossible. He glanced at the older man. "You're telling me?" He paused. His words came slower now. "This woman." He stopped himself, then corrected his own words. "This person." The room noticed. Every single person noticed. The older man answered calmly. "She was one of the most gifted young musicians I had ever seen." Silence. Heavy silence. The businessman said nothing. The words seemed to hit him harder than he expected. He looked around the ballroom, at his guests, at his employees, at the piano, at the young woman sitting in front of it. And slowly, very slowly, memories began returning to him. Not hers, his. Every order he had given, every cold look, every moment he walked past her without seeing her, every time she served him coffee, every time she stood quietly in the background, every time he treated her like part of the furniture. And tonight, he had brought her to the piano to make people laugh. A strange feeling tightened in his chest. Unfamiliar, uncomfortable, almost heavy. He looked away for a moment, as if trying to escape his own thoughts. One of the guests near the front finally spoke. A woman with silver earrings and sharp eyes. She had remained silent all evening, listening, watching, studying. Now she stood, and the room turned toward her. She smiled warmly, then looked directly at the maid. "I run a music foundation." The room grew still again. The woman took another step closer. "We support gifted musicians who were forced to leave their careers behind." The maid listened quietly. The woman continued. "We sponsor performances, training, recordings, international opportunities." A quiet wave of whispers moved through the crowd. Everyone knew her foundation. Even the businessman looked surprised. The woman smiled. "And I have never made an offer this quickly." She paused, then spoke clearly. "In fact," she reached into her purse and removed a small business card. "I would like to invite you." She placed the card gently on the piano beside the old sheet music. "Come audition." The room went completely silent. Even the staff at the doors leaned forward. Some of them looked like they might cry. The young maid stared at the card. Her breathing slowed. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. She looked at the card, then at the older man, then at the piano, then at the businessman. And for several seconds, she said nothing. The businessman watched her closely. For the first time, he looked nervous, because somehow, he already knew, whatever she said next, would matter, not just to her, but to him, to everyone. The older man smiled softly. "You've been hiding long enough." She looked down at the piano keys, then touched one key softly, a single note, gentle, pure. Her voice came quietly, almost like a thought. "I stopped dreaming a long time ago." The woman from the foundation smiled. "Dreams don't expire. The words hung in the air. Simple, but powerful. The maid closed her eyes for a second. And when she opened them, something had changed. The fear was still there. The pain was still there. The memories were still there. But now, so was something else. Strength. Real strength. She slowly stood from the piano bench. The ballroom watched in complete silence. She picked up the business card, then folded her old sheet music carefully. She held both in her hands. Then, very slowly, she turned. Not toward the foundation owner, not toward the older man, but toward the businessman. And the look in her eyes made his breath catch. Because for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the mansion looked completely unprepared for what was coming next. The ballroom felt smaller than ever. No one moved. No one whispered. No glasses touched. No footsteps echoed. Dozens of people stood completely still as the young woman faced the man who owned the mansion. The same man who had brought her to the piano as a joke. The same man who believed tonight would entertain his guests. The same man who thought he knew exactly who she was. And now, for the first time in many years, he looked unsure. Not angry, not proud, not in control, just unsure. The young woman stood quietly, holding the old sheet music in one hand and the business card in the other. Her eyes stayed on him. Calm, steady, clear. The businessman looked back at her, but something had changed in his face. The confidence that usually filled every room around him was gone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The guests waited. The workers waited. Even the older man near the piano remained silent. Everyone knew this moment mattered. Finally, the businessman cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in the silence of the ballroom, it felt louder than the music had. He opened his mouth, then stopped. He looked away for a second, then looked back at her. It was obvious. He didn't know what to say, and maybe that was the first honest thing anyone had seen from him all night. The young woman took one slow breath. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, not loud, not dramatic, but every person in that ballroom heard every word. When I first came here, she looked around the room. At this house, at these halls, at these walls, I thought if I stayed quiet enough, if I worked hard enough, if I became invisible enough, life would leave me alone. The room stayed completely silent. She looked back at him. But life doesn't work that way. The businessman said nothing. She continued. I didn't hide my music because I was ashamed. Her fingers tightened around the old sheet music. I hid it because sometimes, she smiled softly, survival gets louder than dreams. A few guests quietly lowered their eyes. Even some of the workers standing near the doors looked emotional. The businessman's face grew heavier. He looked like every word was landing exactly where it needed to. The young woman took another breath. But tonight, she glanced at the piano, then at the older man, then at the woman from the foundation, then back at the businessman. Tonight reminded me of something. She smiled. A real smile. Talent doesn't disappear. A long silence followed. Then she added quietly, it only waits. No one moved. No one spoke. And somehow, those 4 words hit harder than anything else that night. The businessman slowly looked down at the floor. For a man who spent his life speaking in meetings, leading companies, closing impossible deals, he suddenly looked like someone who had run out of words. His jaw tightened. He took a slow breath. Then another. And when he finally looked up, something in his eyes had changed. Not completely, but enough. He took one step forward, then another, until he stood only a few feet away from her. For the first time in the entire evening, he wasn't looking down on her. He was simply looking at her. As a person. Nothing more. Nothing less. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard. I owe you an apology. A quiet wave moved through the room. Some guests exchanged surprised looks. A few workers stared in complete disbelief. Because no one, absolutely no one, had ever heard those words come from him. Not like this. Not publicly. Not sincerely. He looked directly into her eyes. "When I asked you to sit at that piano," he paused. His voice tightened slightly. "I thought I was creating entertainment." He swallowed. "But the truth is," he looked around the ballroom, then back at her, "I was exposing my own ignorance." Complete silence. The words felt honest, heavy, real. He continued, "I built companies. I built buildings. I built wealth." He looked down at his own hands. "But somewhere along the way," his voice softened, "I forgot how to see people." The workers near the doors looked stunned. Some of them had worked for him for years. And in that moment, even they were seeing someone new. The businessman took one more breath. Then he did something no one expected. He lowered his head. Not dramatically, not for show, just enough. Enough for everyone to understand. And the ballroom fell into complete shock. The young woman looked at him quietly. Not with anger. Not with revenge. Not with pride. Just calm. She studied his face for a moment, then smiled gently, and what she said next surprised everyone even more. "You don't owe me your guilt." The businessman slowly looked up. She continued, "You owe everyone your growth." Silence. Deep silence. Then something happened. The older man near the piano smiled. The woman from the foundation smiled. One of the kitchen workers quietly covered her mouth. And for a few seconds, even the businessman looked speechless again. But this time, for a completely different reason. The young woman looked down at the business card in her hand, then at the old sheet music, then back at the piano. She walked toward it one last time. The guests made space for her. She sat down again. But this time, nobody was waiting for a joke. Nobody was waiting for failure. Nobody was waiting to laugh. Now, they were waiting to listen. She placed the old sheet music in front of her. The paper looked small beneath the crystal lights, but somehow, it looked stronger than anything else in the room. She placed her fingers on the keys, closed her eyes, and began. The first note was soft. The second was warm. The third felt like sunrise. And then, the melody grew. It filled every corner of the mansion. Every hallway, every staircase, every memory, carried pain, hope, loss, strength, childhood, dreams, second chances. And as she played, something changed in everyone listening. The guests stopped being important. The titles disappeared. The money disappeared. The status disappeared. For those few minutes, they were simply people, listening, feeling, remembering. And when the final note faded into silence, no one moved, no one breathed. Then slowly, one pair of hands began to clap. The older man, then another. The woman from the foundation, then another, and within seconds, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. Applause filled the mansion louder than anything those walls had ever heard. The young woman opened her eyes, and for the first time in years, she wasn't surviving. She was home. Months later, her first public performance would reach millions. Her story would inspire people in places she had never even seen. And the mansion on the hill changed too, because from that night forward, the man who owned everything finally learned that the most valuable things in life can never be bought, only recognized.